Hello, it's nice to see you again. Over the past 9 or 10 times, I've been uploading videos about preparing for adulthood. Last time I answered questions many parents had submitted, but today, although the case might be a bit different, I think there are still many people who can relate. So we've invited a parent to join us for a Q&A session. Thank you for taking the time to be here. I'd appreciate it if you could briefly introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Yes, hello. My child is currently in high school. Soon, graduation is coming up. I heard that after graduation, my child needs to be re-evaluated for an autism diagnosis. But my child is high functioning and does not have a support teacher assigned. In the case of a child like mine, I heard that if they were diagnosed with autism before becoming an adult, they need to be reassessed for eligibility by CLBC. But since my child is relatively high functioning, I'm concerned that CLBC might deny eligibility, so I'm wondering how we should prepare and what we should do in that situation.
I can't say with absolute certainty that what I'm telling you is 100% accurate, but I'll share what I know based on my experience and various pieces of information. As far as I know, before graduating from high school, if it's a public school, psychologists or other specialists assigned by the school conduct the assessments and diagnoses. But, of course, those specialists are going to make their diagnoses objectively. However, from a parent's perspective, their child might behave just fine at school, but then show signs of autism at home or in other situations. So if parents feel that the diagnosis made by the specialist seems too severe or doesn't seem right, I think it would be good to get a private diagnosis separately. Of course, you'll eventually need to register as a recipient with CLBC using this diagnosis, but CLBC doesn't make their decision based solely on the diagnosis report. They also have their own system called GSA, which stands for Guide to Support Allocation. They use this to assign a level or grade. The levels range from 1 to 5, with level 5 meaning the person needs the most support, and level 1 meaning they need almost no support. So how does CLBC do this? They interview the parents and they also interview the child. Based on these interviews, there are usually 10 question items. Among those, there are items like communication and how day-to-day decisions are made. There are 10 such categories. That's why there's something called a GSA. For each of those items, CLBC usually assigns a score from 1 to 5. So, if someone needs 100% assistance, for example, then more than 90% is needed, then that would probably be a score of 5. But I don't need any help at all. Then it could be a score of 1, and if they need a moderate amount of help, it would be around 3. So then all the scores for these 10 items will be gathered together, right? If you add them up and divide by 10, you get the average score. If you get a score of 5 on all of them, the average will be 5. That would mean the person needs the most help, and in some cases, some items might be 5 points, others 3 points or 2 points, so the scores can be divided in various ways. Especially in the case of high-functioning individuals, there probably won't be many 5s. Most scores will be 3s or 4s, or even 2s. So even if someone has been diagnosed with autism, they might not qualify for eligibility under CLBC. CLBC has 2 categories. One is DD, which stands for Developmental Disability, and the other is PSI, which stands for Personalized Support Initiative. Usually PSI is a service mainly received by high-functioning individuals. But there are cases where someone doesn't qualify for PSI either. If the functioning is too good, you might think, my child obviously doesn't fall under DD. So if they're high-functioning, do they qualify for PSI? You can ask a professional who does the assessments about these things, and if you don't qualify for PSI, it can be difficult to receive services from CLBC. So in those cases, you need to talk with CLBC and explain that even though the diagnosis came out a certain way, your child actually has these specific difficulties. But since CLBC mainly makes decisions based on documents and interviews, the most important thing is to get a diagnosis that qualifies for the PSI level. Ultimately, even for the professionals doing the assessments, it's not like taking an X-ray or a photo. They rely on various interviews and observations. So it's related to how the parents describe things. But what's considered objective can be a bit ambiguous. Parents, understandably, may not want to openly talk about what their child can't do. For example, or if the actual fact is 50, parents might consciously or unconsciously be, say it's 70 or 80. Of course, that doesn't mean you should exaggerate in the other direction and say, for the sake of getting a diagnosis, that even though the real score is 50, it's only 10 or 20. Rather, you should try to be as objective as possible. So, compared to children of the same age, you need to assess whether your child can do certain things independently or if they are the same as their peers. These are the kinds of things you need to evaluate. So up until elementary school, children may seem similar, but by high school, especially as they approach their 20s, typically developing children have almost all the abilities of an adult, whereas our children don't quite reach that level. But from a parent's perspective, because things have improved a lot compared to before, you might feel like your child can do everything now. However, in those situations, when you compare your child to other children, especially typically developing children, it's important to take a more objective stance during interviews and consider just how much support our children actually need in these areas. The reason I'm saying this is because when I talk with parents, I often hear them respond this way, even when I ask directly. For example, I might ask, can your child use public transportation well? Then, if you train, you can ride it. When they answer like this, it becomes ambiguous. Generally, by the time a child is in middle school, they can find their way anywhere, even in a completely unfamiliar place, or even overseas, but our children need to go through training to do that. So, can we really say they can use public transportation? It's really hard to answer this with a simple yes or no. It's actually more accurate to say that there are several areas where they are lacking.
Then, in those cases, so when my child is in an optimal state and feeling good, their behavior is one thing, but on the other hand, when my child isn't feeling well or is in a bad mood, that's, in a way, the worst case scenario. In those situations, due to certain emotional factors, the child might display problematic behaviors.
Yes.
So, are you saying that you are conducting this interview with those things in mind?
That's right. Because during the interview, the person asking the questions might not give you the opportunity to talk about those things. Of course, if those kinds of questions come up during the interview, you should talk about them, but in most cases, they don't really come up. And in certain situations, some undesirable or challenging behaviors might appear. You absolutely need to mention those kinds of things. So you need to pay attention to those aspects so that the specialist can take them into account. And in fact, one of the pieces of advice I give to parents is to write those things down as they happen in daily life. The reason is that if you only talk about it, the specialists or professionals might not actually take it seriously. So if possible, it's good to write those things down. Of course, having photos or videos would be even better, but in urgent situations, when it's not really possible to take pictures or record videos. Still, if you keep a record of those things and turn them into objective proof or documentation, I think that would be even better.
So when I go for an interview, while what I say will be taken into consideration, it's still important to gather and present as much evidence or supporting material as possible.
That's definitely more reliable. The reason is, in cases like the PSI, they often ask a lot of questions related to executive function in everyday life. And those kinds of questions are usually asked in interviews with the parents. So, since the assessment is based almost entirely on the standards or perspectives of the parents, I'm saying that it would be much more helpful if there are various documents to support what you mentioned earlier about trying to speak objectively or anything else that can back that up.
So, are you saying that we always collect these documents from teachers who have received various treatments through MCFT, and that the materials that have been collected over a long period of time will be of great help when obtaining qualifications from CLB?
That's right. And especially in the case of our high-functioning children, there aren't many issues with their abilities, but mentally or even in ordinary situations, our kids sometimes panic. It would be good to keep a detailed record of those kinds of incidents.
Understood. Okay, then I have another question. In my child's case, although they were diagnosed with autism as an adult, ultimately because their functioning is good according to the CLBC, they were not assigned a level and have to live as an adult without support. In such cases, if various problematic behaviours arise in social life, is it possible to receive an adult autism diagnosis again? And get support from the CLBC?
So your question is, even though someone has been diagnosed with autism, if they are unable to receive services from the CLBC, or if they don't even get the diagnosis, they just live a typical adult life. But as they go about their social life, various issues can arise. In fact, when it comes to having a job, it's not just about having good skills, and communication is important. Teamwork is important, and being able to follow instructions well is also important. So when it comes to working, it's not just skills that matter. These other factors are important too. But for our friends with autism, even if they are high functioning, the most challenging parts are communication, teamwork, and relationships in social life. Because these aspects are difficult, even if they have some professional expertise, it may not be easy to work together. So situations like that can definitely happen. That's why this part is always so difficult. There are actually many people on the borderline, or even those who have graduated from college or even graduate school. But once they get a job, they find it hard to adapt to work life and end up quitting soon after. This is one of the problems. The government has a set budget, and since they have to provide services first to those who need help the most, there has to be a cutoff point somewhere. So people who function relatively well may not be eligible for support. But if these people are able to function well in society, there's no problem. The issue is with this middle group, those who can't manage social life, but also can't receive government support. This group is always a problem. That's why I always say, from when children are young, that we should support our children based on whether they need help or not, rather than any other standard. If you judge based on whether or not someone has received a diagnosis, there's a high chance you'll end up in this kind of situation. So this is related to the question you asked a little while ago. If help is needed, then support should be provided in whatever form is necessary. But for the government to provide assistance, certain criteria have to be met. So as I mentioned earlier, a diagnosis might not have been made in the past, but as someone gets older, it can come up at any time. The reason is that while our children also develop, typically developing children progress even faster. So as they get older, the gap actually widens. Even though our children have improved, the other typically developing peers improve even more, so the gap widens. For example, a diagnosis might not have been made at age 15, but if tested at age 20, it could show up. It could also be diagnosed at age 30. So if, for example, they can't work and don't receive any other kind of support, they end up just staying at home. In that case, both the child and the parents end up in a very difficult situation. So at that point, you need to find a private diagnostician again, talk more about the various difficulties you've experienced so far, and get confirmation through them that you need help. So then with that, you apply to CLBC again, go through the eligibility process, and make efforts to receive the support. If you want to receive government support, passing the eligibility process is essential. Previously, it was assumed that the person would be able to function in society, and that's why the decision was made that way. But in reality, after trying it, it turns out that it still doesn't work, right? So you need to make a strong case about those aspects, get reevaluated, and even if you don't get a diagnosis, talk to CLBC to find out how you can receive support. Of course, besides this, do you happen to know about PWD? Is different from CLBC. I briefly mentioned this in a previous video, but with PWD, even if you haven't been diagnosed, it's considered a form of income assistance. PWD stands for Person with Disability. To be precise, the government refers to this as disability assistance. So if you qualify for this, you receive about $500 a month in income support. In other words, it's a disability allowance. You can receive that kind of support. If you're not working, you don't have any income. So you can receive that, and separately there's something called the CLBC service. So as I mentioned earlier, the CLBC service is not for those with severe disabilities, but since you can't just stay at home, there's usually something called a community inclusion program. It's called CI funding. And if you receive it, you can use it for your child, for example, to help them learn life skills, social skills, or for career development. If your child is going to spend time during the day engaging in various activities, someone needs to help them, right? But if you want to hire someone, you ultimately need money, and the government provides a certain amount of funding for these things. That's what CI funding is. So, as I briefly explained last time, sometimes the CI funding is given to an agency. Other times, the parents receive it directly. In the case of high-functioning individuals, rather than enrolling them in a standardized program, parents often want their child to be able to do what they want. In such cases, it's not a bad idea for the parents to receive the funding and use it to support whatever the child needs. So the CI funding provided by CLBC is similar to the funding our child is currently receiving from MCFD and the autism funding, right? You could say they're similar. But with autism funding, usually parents register a service provider, then hire the service provider, and the funding for their child is allocated within the autism funding program. That's how it's used. Of course, with autism funding, there is also a way for parents to receive it directly. In that sense, they're quite similar, but just remember that with CLBC, the CI funding is given directly to the parents. The amount of CI funding depends on what level you receive from CLBC. It's related to that. The funding amount varies accordingly. And as you mentioned earlier, with this kind of funding, you can find and register for programs that can fill in the skills your child needs or wants. Does it have to be only autism-related programs? Or can it also be for things the child is interested in or wants as a future career? For example, if the child is good at drawing. So I want to become a graphic designer. So in order to develop certain skills so that they can have a job and live independently in society, can this funding be used to upgrade such skills, even if it's not specifically related to autism? Yes, it can be used for that. As I mentioned a little earlier, there are three main categories, and one of them is career development. What you just mentioned falls under career development. So, for example, to become a graphic designer, you need to learn more about drawing. In that case, it's already stipulated that places like private academies are not allowed, but there are detailed regulations for that as well. So you'll receive all these detailed rules when you get the support, and you just need to follow them. Usually people use tutors a lot for this purpose. Our children with autism often learn better one-on-one. So in that case, you can hire a specialist and use the funds to pay for them to teach your child. And if your child wants to join a program to meet friends, someone needs to help them out, because our kids can't really do it on their own. So at those times, you also need someone who can help. You can use the funds to pay that person as well. In fact, you can even use it for a personal trainer individually. So you can use it for most things related to life skills, social skills, and career development.
So, after becoming an adult, there's the CI funding you can receive from CLBC and then from PWD. There's also some income support provided to adults who have been diagnosed with autism.
Yes. It's called a disability benefit. Yes.
Disability benefit. This was actually a question we were always very curious about. So after a child is diagnosed with autism as an adult, preparing so that they can receive the most appropriate level from CLBC. I think that's extremely important. Yes, and through this interview, I felt that we really need to prepare well for this process, whether it's the paperwork or gathering the necessary proof, so that even after becoming an adult, we can continue to receive proper support. Thank you for providing such clear and accurate answers to all these questions.
Yes. Some parents, because their child is high functioning up until high school, hear from the school specialist at graduation that their child has no problems. There are some people who are happy to see me like this, and if after that the child graduates from college or gets a job and does well, that is certainly the most ideal situation. But in reality, after graduating from high school, some find it difficult to get into college, and working at a job is also challenging. So after 2 or 3 years, or even several years, they end up just staying at home. There are actually some parents who ask what they should do in that situation. So what I tell them is, I'm not saying that ordinary people should exaggerate their situation to get a diagnosis or anything like that. Rather, if help is needed, it's the parent's role to provide support so that their child can receive that help, because our children can't do that on their own. So it's better to be aware of these things in advance, and in fact, to get a proper assessment around the time when they graduate from high school and become adults. The reason is that it can become more difficult to get assessed later on. So if possible, it's better to get it done ahead of time. Even if you have the assessment, you can always decide, I don't need it right now. And that's perfectly fine. Then if later on you find that you do need it, you can use it at that time. And that's another way you can approach it. So in my opinion, it's best to make sure you pass the eligibility test properly so that you can be registered with CLBC without any issues.
Thank you so much for your helpful advice today and for sharing such detailed information with our mothers.
Yes, thank you for taking the time to be here. All right, we'll wrap up here for today. I hope this information will also be helpful to other parents and families in similar situations. Thank you for watching until the end. We'll see you next time with a different topic.